and we can put together a blog post that answers some.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering how that was going to be handled, because I'm sure people have questions.
I'm sure. So
you might want to explain that to people. Sean, will you let people know that?
Sure.
Okay.
So it is 5:30. We're going to give it another couple minutes for folks to sign in before we get started.
Okay, well, we have some trail ambassadors here. I see Mary Phelan. Who else is a trail ambassador? Annie.
I see quite a few. Dean,
yeah.
And let me see, Anne,
Debbie.
Eileen,
Debbie.
Oh, Eric Dahlberg has raised his hand. So we've got quite a few. Yeah, we've got quite a few trail ambassadors on board. So good show of solidarity for our first virtual trail ambassador talk ever. Our first live, I should say live. I'll say give it another couple minutes. Trying to come up with a fun fact to entertain you guys with while we wait for the rock show to begin.
Oh boy.
And this is a rock show. We've got some real rock stars. I should have actually downloaded some guitar riff sound clips to throw in between when I bring up some slides of rock photos.
All right, if you start singing "We Will Rock You," I'm going to slap you.
We're doing this virtually, so you can't. So now maybe I will. Just yeah. So I usually am way too punny, and I didn't put any puns into tonight's presentation. So you're welcome. So shall we get things started?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So welcome everybody. I'm hoping that I know I can see everybody. I hope that I have pinned you guys properly. Okay. Yeah. So welcome everybody. I hope that everybody is doing well and staying healthy. And welcome to, as I've already said, this is our very first live virtual Trail Ambassador talk. So I hope everything goes well. We don't have any sort of technical hiccups. But I'm so happy to see so many people joining us tonight. My name is Sean Green. I'm the volunteer manager with Friends of the Wissahickon, and I'm going to be moderating tonight's discussion. This will be, the presentation will be in discussion format, basically. So I've got questions, and our trail ambassadors have some answers, hopefully have some answers. And you guys will probably have questions of your own. You'll notice that the chat feature on Zoom is disabled, but please reach out to us at FOW. You can actually send it directly to me, which is green, like the color, at FOW.org. If you have any follow-up geology questions, and we can put together a post that answers some of your burning questions about the rocks in the Wissahickon. But for anybody that's new to us, just to give you some info about Friends of the Wissahickon, we are a 96-year-old nonprofit organization. We are the official stewards of Wissahickon Valley Park. So again, if you're unfamiliar, which most likely you're very familiar if you're tuning in to hear about the rocks of the Wissahickon, you know that it's an absolute treasure. It's 1,800 acres. We have over 50 miles of trails, and it's just, to me, the most beautiful place. It's my favorite place. It's a treasure to many people. And Friends of the Wissahickon, as I said, we are the official stewards. So we basically take care of the park. We keep it clean, sustainable, and welcoming to all visitors throughout Philadelphia and the surrounding areas. We do a lot of trail work, cleanups, guided hikes, building and repairing structures, removing fallen trees, basically anything you can think of in the park. FOW does with our volunteers. So we are a volunteer-based organization, and we're also member-based. So if you're not a member, please become a member. or if you'd like to get involved with us, then give us a look at fow.org and check out what we have going on, which I admittedly, because of coronavirus, is limited, but we are starting to phase into some organized volunteer opportunities. So keep your eyes peeled, and we will have plenty for you to do if you're interested in getting involved in the park. So as I said, this is our first live virtual Trail Ambassador talk. Trail ambassadors, if you're new to this, are a trained volunteer corps that work with us. They do a wide variety of things, and one of them is guided walks and talks. And our 3 trail ambassadors that we have with us tonight have actually led talks and walks in the park. And because of the current coronavirus situation, we have moved to a virtual format to talk about this really fascinating topic of geology. What I'd like to do is probably just move on to introducing our 3 rock stars. Why don't we get things started with Sarah? If you can tell me, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in Wissahickon geology.
Okay, I've been a trail ambassador since 2008, the first class, and I should say that I've loved being a trail ambassador, and I recommend it highly to people who would like to do this kind of thing. I'm a retired teacher, and I really enjoy learning things. I think I learn something new every time I observe something in the Wissahickon. And so I'm not really an expert at what we're going to talk about, but I consider myself a student of the Wissahickon. I became interested in Wissahickon geology through taking a National Science Foundation course for teachers that was given at Chestnut Hill College in 1985. And we did study geology for about half the day. And we took a field trip to the Wissahickon. It was the first time I'd really ever looked closely at rocks. Our leaders used very technical language that was hard to understand. And I was there with some other colleagues, and we decided that we would like to try to translate what he had said. There were actually 2 geologists there, what they had said into language that was a little more accessible to ourselves and to the people we taught and maybe to others. And so we did write a very short little booklet called Discovering the Wissahickon. And after that, I was invited to give a few guided walks for the Mount Airy Learning Tree and Chestnut Hill College. And to do this, I had to learn a whole lot more about Wissahickon geology. So I really enjoyed this journey that I've been taking to gradually acquire some information, some knowledge about what we're going to talk about tonight.
Well, thank you for learning so much, because you've taught so much of us about the geology in the Wissahickon. Next up, we have Jenny Prince. Hi, Jenny.
Hi. So I'm Jenny Prince. I've been a trail ambassador since I think 2016 about. I'm also a Pennsylvania master naturalist. I grew up in Mount Airy, spent time in the Wissahickon as a kid, took many a science class there. Sarah's actually one of my previous science teachers from school. Moved away, but now that I moved back, I enjoy learning more about the Wissahickon now, incorporating all the history and the nature and stuff like that. I've also been more interested in trees, and as I've learned more about trees, I got interested in soil, and then that just naturally leads into the rocks and geology. So that's kind of how my take on that is. And I find it interesting, like how it really gives you a sense, like trees and the rocks give you a sense of place, like even driving down Lincoln Drive, all those jagged rocks, or the houses and the bridges that are made out of the Wissahickon schist. Like, you know, you're in Philadelphia when you go down, you see those things. What else? So yeah, I'm not that great at identifying rocks, but I do like the processes that create them. So I find that very fascinating. That's my little journey.
Thanks, Jenny. And then next up, finally, we have Lisa Myers. Lisa, how are you doing? Tell us what got you interested in the rocks of the Wissahickon.
Hi, everybody. My name is Lisa, and I have been a trail crew leader and trail ambassador with Friends of the Wissahickon since about 2017. My interest in rocks began when I was working at a crystal shop in Florida. And I learned from a coworker that a lot of the crystals and stones that you are buying in these stores have actually been enhanced in some way, whether that's dyed or extra heat treated. So it got me wondering what these rocks and minerals look like in the raw state. So I am a native of Roxborough. I did move away for a very long time. And when I came back in 2016, I went through the trail ambassador and trail crew leader training. And also, like Jenny, I am also a Pennsylvania master naturalist. And once I went through all these trainings, I really became interested in the geology of the Wissahickon, and not just rocks. The study of rocks is petrology, but geology is much broader in scope, and it explains not just the physical structure of the earth, but all the processes that go into creating and destroying that and the cycles involved. So it's a journey. I am by no means an expert. I am very much a student, but a dedicated one. So
Thank you. So none of us are experts, but we're all enthusiasts. And so I'm excited to learn from you guys. So let's get things started. As I understand it, a lot of geology professors bring their classes specifically to the Wissahickon to study rocks. So what is it about the rocks of Wissahickon Gorge that are so unique that brings in so many people to look at them?
So I guess I'll take that question.
And actually, before you start, give me 1 second, because I have some visuals.
There it is.
Okay, so here we go. What are we looking at here?
So this is it says the geologic map of Pennsylvania. And that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of people come to the Wissahickon to learn about the geology. I mean, if you look, I don't know if you can full screen it again.
There we go.
Yeah. So Philadelphia is located down on the bottom right-hand corner, or the southeast corner of Pennsylvania. Down there, you see a kind of a yellow strip and a dark brown strip, but we're more closer to that tan color. But I guess we're right around there. So those, if you look at the key below, those are Precambrian. So they're one of the oldest rocks in Pennsylvania, approximately 540 million years old. So that's what makes us really unique, is that we have access to those rocks down there. And the gorge itself, the Wissahickon Gorge itself, is kind of on the edges of two ecoregions, the Piedmont region and the coastal plains. So there's lots to look at above the ground as well. I've taken other geology classes, I forgot to mention, in college. And when you go out to look for rocks there, it was either a long drive to get to places, climb a mountain, pull over on a busy highway to look at a cut through. But here, I think why people come to visit or to look at the rocks here is partially the accessibility. Here you can drive or take a bus to one of the many access points and just hike or walk a short distance to see all these different kinds of rocks and evidence of plate tectonics, which happens deep down in the earth, which Lisa will go and Sarah will go more into. So they have some really interesting, there's some interesting finds in the Wissahickon to see. And due to the gorge's age, I mean, it's just so old, there are certain things like, there's human activity that has happened, such as cutting into hillsides for quarrying, which we'll also talk about a little bit. So you can see inside the mountain a little bit. There's weathering. I think you can show the next slide, Sean.
Yes.
So there's evidence of weathering, and like we've had some really bad recent storms, and flooding, and that just cuts away a lot of the soil and helps erode the rock. So we can see it and study it a little better. Not so good for the environment, but good for us to study it. And then you can also see at the bottom picture that that's just eroded the rock on top of that fold has eroded. So you can see that fold up close and personal.
Mhm.
And then the big thing that makes us be able to see the geology is the Wissahickon Creek itself. It's been there for thousands of years and has cut through and created the gorge and opened up, exposed the underlying rock surfaces so we can see it. So I think that's what makes it interesting, you know, so that we can see it, it's accessible, and we can study it and people can enjoy it. So that's
Old and accessible.
that's right.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. Lisa, Sarah, do you have anything to add to?
No, I think accessibility is huge. And
Yeah.
I think that, and the fact that these are the oldest rocks, the oldest rock formations in the state.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And they just show all kinds of processes that shape rocks. And they show the effects, as Jenny said, of plate tectonics. So they're just good foundation for basic geology.
Okay. And I know we're going to be getting into some of those processes and plate tectonics in a little bit. So one question for anybody that hasn't been upstream from Wissahickon Valley Park is the Wissahickon Creek begins about 20 miles north of us in Montgomery County. Fun fact, it begins at a spring right by the Montgomery County Mall parking lot, which is an interesting fact that that's where it begins and then flows. But it flows through some relatively flat land and then suddenly hits Philadelphia, and you're suddenly in this big rocky gorge. So why is the park so geologically different from what's upstream?
And I think that's for me, right?
That is for you, Sarah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if you are familiar with geology textbooks, a typical stream starts in upland, often in rocky areas, and flows very rapidly at first, and then eventually flows through more gentle land and may go through some kind of wetland slowly before it joins another body of water. And our Wissahickon Creek is, I call it a backwards stream. It arises in gently sloping land. Some of the water that forms in its origin is actually runoff from the parking lot at Montgomery Mall, but more typical origin of the stream is showed in the left-hand picture, little springs that come out of very gentle land up near Ambler. And so we're kind of starting where a typical stream might be in the course of the middle part of its life. And then at the end, the stream enters around Chestnut Hill College and the stables that are there on Northwestern Avenue. It goes suddenly from a gentle rolling land into a little mountainous gorge, and where the land on each side is much steeper and the rate of flow is much faster. The drop off is about 108 feet from Chestnut Hill College, that area of Germantown Avenue, down to the mouth of the creek. So we're ending in a mountainous gorge rather than beginning in one. And I think that needs to be explained. There are a number of different explanations that have been offered, but the one that makes the most sense to me is one that involves a concept of terranes. And Sean, can we take a look at the next slide? Is that the terrain slide?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. We know that a number of pieces of land on the West Coast and the East Coast of the United States are what are called terranes. They're pieces of land that were at one time probably in a closing ocean. The Atlantic Ocean is an opening ocean, but its predecessor was a closing ocean. And some of the pieces of land in that ocean got stuck on the North American continent when this massive continent Pangaea that you may have heard of formed. And they didn't separate when the ocean reopened. And you can see that in New England, there are a number of terrains that have been identified, pieces of land, foreign pieces of land that have joined a continent. And the one I'd like you to look at is called Avalonia. It makes up much of the coast of New England and maybe extends further down. Now, I think the rocks of the Wissahickon are a terrain because there's a very sudden change from the kind of rock in the Wissahickon to a different kind of rock when you cross Northwestern Avenue and cross a fault line. And so I like this idea. It explains the backward nature of the Wissahickon Creek. And I think all the geological processes that went on in the past to shape our Earth are continuing today. And an analogy of what's going on today that is going to make terrains, we might look at the Mediterranean, which is a little closing ocean. North Africa is driving north into Europe, forming a massive mountain range that we call the Alps that extends all the way across southern Europe and actually goes into Turkey and connects with the Himalayas. And so all those pieces of land, Sardinia, Corsica, that you see, Sicily, that are in the Mediterranean will at some point become terrains stuck on probably the European continent. And if that ocean ever opens up again in the very distant future, they would remain stuck. We already have a big terrain that's stuck on Europe, and probably Greece's as well. But Italy was at one time probably separate from Europe and has been pushed up into Europe, forming a mountain range. And so we can think of an analogy being in a closing ocean that eventually formed Pangaea, and pieces of land getting stuck on North America. And I think our Wissahickon, which doesn't have its own special name as a terrain, but I think it may well have been one. And I think that's we're ready for your next question, Sean.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. So it sounds like a lot of this has to do with plate tectonics. So I would love to hear more about how plate tectonics work. And I think, Lisa, you have an answer for us.
I do have an answer. Plate tectonics is what's responsible for forming all the topographical features that we have on our planet. Sarah talked about supercontinents being formed and breaking apart, opening and closing oceans. This is all a result of plate tectonics. Mountain building events, volcano forming and volcanic events, earthquakes. This is all a result of plate tectonics. So we have basically three kind of movements that we'll talk about. So think of pieces of the Earth's crust, we'll call them plates, and they move relative to each other very slowly over long periods of time. We could have a whole nother talk on wrapping our heads around geologic time. But these things happen, they've happened before, they're happening now, and they will continue to happen. So these plates are moving very slowly relative to each other over the underlying mantle. So what you see here on this slide are pictures of converging plates. So plates that converge move toward each other. They can collide, and land to land plates could collide. What you see here is subducting plates. So you could have two ocean plates subducting, or a land and an ocean plate subducting. And what happens is the denser plate will move underneath the more buoyant plate. So that's converging plates. Now, another kind of plate movement we have is called divergent, and that's when plates move apart. This kind of activity will form things like rifts and basins, and typically we see this on the ocean floor. The third kind is transform plates, And that's where in transform plate boundaries, the plates are moving, they're sliding past each other in opposite directions. Now, the best example of this is to think about the San Andreas Fault. That's an example of transform plate boundaries moving, sliding past each other. Now, when these plates get locked together, a lot of energy builds up, and when these plates release, you have an earthquake. So that's basically kind of the basis of plate tectonics.
So everything can be blamed on plate tectonics, basically.
Yes,
And
it's
the
the
formation of mountains
answer of
is basically plates crashing into each other.
Yeah.
I mean, and it is really, really interesting theory that, that the rocks that we have in the Wissahickon were at one time on the other side of the world. So makes things very unique. And here are some of those Wissahickon rocks.
Right.
So plate tectonics are also responsible for a lot of times on hikes in the park. I'll see, rocks that kind of have layers that are clearly like pushed up on their side, and so they are also responsible for forcing those rocks upright. Is that correct?
That's true. What you're looking at here, this outcropping can be seen from the Valley Green Bridge. And what you're looking at is probably what's left from a larger formation that has been weathered down over time, and this is what we see. But you mentioned rocks being tilted and whatnot. Typically, I've read that the angle that these rocks are at, the force that made them that way, it's perpendicular. So the force that made those rocks in those positions was applied in a perpendicular way to force them. But the biggest thing you want to see here is how folded it is. And that is an example of processes that occur very, very deep under the Earth's surface, 10 to 15 miles, I've read. So when rock encounters heat and pressure at that depth, that's where this folding and fracturing and faulting and all kind of things like that happen to the rock, and then uplift pushes it up, erosion wears it down, and then you have, evidence of this all throughout the Wissahickon.
Yeah, and it is also interesting and worth mentioning, as you said, that this is constantly moving underground, and what we're seeing now is just a snapshot of what's here right now, and it'll eventually give it some geologic time, which we're not going to get into the concept, but a long, long time, and it's going to look very, very different. Which actually brings me to my next question. Let's talk about some Wissahickon rocks. And Lisa, while I have you here, I'd like, before we get into some of the common rocks of the Wissahickon and maybe how they were formed, let's talk about the rock cycle to give folks kind of a primer on how rocks happen.
Sure. So like most earth materials, rocks are created and destroyed in cycles. So if you look at the top of this diagram, we'll start with sediments. And sediments are particles like sand or silt or gravel, pieces of clay. And what happens through weathering and the process of water transporting and depositing these sediments different places, they begin to stack up and layer. And then a chemical process called lithification actually cements and compacts these sediments together even more. And as they get further cemented and compacted and pushed together, we have sedimentary rock that has formed. Now, as this rock gets pushed further down into underneath the surface and comes in contact with heat and pressure, another process happens, and the metamorphism of the sedimentary rock occurs. So this is, the deeper you go, the more heat and pressure the sedimentary rock will come into contact with, and it changes the rock. It changes how the minerals in the rock are organized, and the rock changes form. So it begins to basically melt. And as it melts and becomes molten, we know we can kind of identify two forms of that. The molten rock that stays below the surface is called magma, and the molten rock that leaves and comes to the surface through a volcano, volcanic activity, we call that lava. Now, over time, this molten rock will cool and solidify in a process that we call crystallization. The rock then moves into its igneous phase. And so now we have igneous rock. And through weathering and time and forces like water and wind, breaks the igneous rock and breaks other rock down back into sediments, and it just starts again. So a couple things I want to say here. They don't necessarily have to go in this order. They can occur in different orders, but a couple things that we do know, because we have examples of all these rocks in the Wissahickon, mostly metamorphic rock. But because the rock is metamorphic, we are not going to find fossils in our rocks here because of the extreme heat and pressure that the sedimentary rock was exposed to. So to my knowledge, there wouldn't be any fossils in the Wissahickon. But this is basically the three types: sedimentary, metamorphic, and igneous.
And you said we mostly have metamorphic rocks, so it means we have rocks that were formed very, very far down in the earth.
Yes.
Cool. So let's talk about some of these common Wissahickon rocks. So first up, probably the most common that everybody probably knows about is schist and quartzite.
Okay, so let's talk about schist and quartzite. So schist, any of the rocks that we're going to be talking about in the next couple minutes, you can find great examples of these on the Valley Green Bridge. They're all there. So let's start with schist. Now, if you live in Philadelphia, you have seen this rock. Many buildings are constructed of this because it was very soft when it was quarried, so it was very malleable and easy to shape. And then once it was exposed to air for a while, it hardened. So it was a prime building material. Schist comes, the parent rock of schist is shale, and that was a sedimentary rock that undergoes the metamorphic process that I just talked about a few minutes ago, and heat and pressure changes this shale into schist. There are also some other minerals that you'll find it with schist, and Sarah will be talking about those, but I can tell you that a lot of the schist in the Wissahickon has garnets and tourmaline in them, and Sarah will explain a little bit about how they came to be there. But a couple identifying features of schist is that foliated appearance, where it looks like it's in sheets, and it's very irregular and very rough, very folded. And if you had a nail, you could actually scratch schist fairly easily. The other thing to note is schist always has that mica in it, and that's that shiny little flecks of shiny material. So that's a little bit about schist, and then the picture at the bottom with the children on it, that's a very large exposure that you can see on Forbidden Drive. And you can, again, get up close and look at that waviness, and you'll see other minerals in there. And so that's what I can tell you about schist. Now, the next common rock we have is quartzite. The parent rock of quartzite was sandstone. So again, as sandstone met with extreme heat and pressure, the metamorphic process begins and changes sandstone into quartzite. They're very, very different textures, whereas you see the schist is rough and kind of crinkly. The quartzite will feel a little smoother, and it's a little harder to scratch with that nail. There can be other minerals mixed in with the quartzite. Sarah will talk a little bit about that. The difference, you know, I know for me, it took me a while to realize the difference between quartz and quartzite. Quartzite is sandstone that has undergone metamorphosis, and the quartz is just a mineral that could be found possibly in quartz, and Sarah will talk a little bit more about that. But if you go to Valley Green and you start on the Orange Trail on one of our self-guided hikes, you'll come to where that little pagoda is. And that rock outcropping there, that's where this picture was taken. And you can see the difference. The schist layer and the quartzite layer are side by side, and they alternate throughout that whole exposure. And if you run your hand over it, you will be able to see the difference in those textures. So
Great. Thank you, Lisa. And schist is probably the most prevalent. I've had people ask why there's so much broken glass on the trails. And it's not glass, it's actually mica, specks of mica. It's beautiful. So the next rock we have, it's pronounced gneiss, and this is actually how you spell it. Jenny, can you tell us about gneiss and what is not gneiss or gnaughty?
Of course. So gneiss, gneiss, yes, the G is silent. It's also it's common in the Wissahickon. You'll see it throughout. There's large examples, there's small examples. But gneiss is a highly metamorphic rock, both in that it was formed under high pressure and high temperature, to the point where the minerals in the rock had to separate into bands. But it hasn't melted, it's just kind of reformed and has shaped these, as Lisa said, those foliated or layered texture. And gneiss is easily identifiable because of that. It's that dark and light bands you can see on the rocks on the left-hand side. Those rocks are gneiss. The top one is a common black and white gneiss, and the bottom one kind of has an orange hue, orange and a gray hue, and that's a Baltimore gneiss. And then the rocks on the right-hand side are not gneiss. You can see they're not banded. The one on the bottom is more speckled. I think that's probably granite. And then the one on the top is more of just a solid color. So those are not gneiss. And that's basically it in a nutshell. It's not really, gneiss is not based on what the rock is made out of. It's more just the look of it. Okay.
Interesting. Well, I think all rocks are nice, but that's without the G. So I'm sorry, I can't avoid the puns. So next up we have pegmatite.
Yeah, and I think that's my job to explain that. Pegmatite has got the same composition as granite, but the crystals in the pegmatite are bigger, so the texture feels rough, much more rough than granite. Pegmatite probably had a higher water content when it was in the magma formation. It's a probably igneous rock most of the time. Sometimes it forms from a very high level of metamorphism. But the sample on the left is a piece of pegmatite. In reality, it's about the size of your fist, a big fist. And it's got a little schist frosting on the top and some schist in the two layers. So it looks like it's a 3-layered rock. And the white coarse crystals are feldspar. It also has quartz in it, little flecks of quartz that maybe look gray and kind of translucent. And sometimes there's little black dots in it called hornblende. Granite has the same kind of composition, except, well, the feldspar can have different colors. It can be white or pink or even green. But the quartz and the hornblende are generally their typical colors. When the pegmatite is igneous, it can flow. And the picture that you see, the larger picture on the right, shows a big band of pegmatite that is actually flowed through 2 separated layers. The very bottom layer is schist, and the layer right above the lighter colored pegmatite is quartzite. And this rock formed, as we said, 10 miles or so deep underground, where during the converging of plates producing high heat and high pressure, and the quartzite and schist layers separated enough for that pegmatite to flow through. Because those rocks are parallel, they would be called sills. And that's one of the sites that one of our self-guided tours take you on. If you decide to undertake one of our self-guided tours, you can actually see that rock with a large pegmatite flow in it. So should we go to the next slide, Sean?
Yeah. I mean, I just want to stop to say just how interesting it is that we have so many different types of rock all joined together. I think it's so easy to think you go out and you look at a rock and it's all the same type, but that's not the case. You have, as you said, sills of one layer, then another, and it's just so completely fascinating. But moving on, vein quartz. We have quite a few examples of this here.
Most of the rock in the Wissahickon is metamorphic, and some of it is igneous, such as the pegmatite flows. But there is one kind of sedimentary rock. Now, the parent rock of both quartzite and schist was what we call detrital sedimentary rock. It was made of particles that were carried by erosion and settled down into layers and eventually were compressed into rock. But there is another kind of sedimentary rock called chemical sedimentary rock. And this forms much the same way fossils, geodes, form. That this is, again, a process that is occurring far underground where conditions are hot. And in the basic parent rock, the schist and the quartzite, cracks have developed that allow either pegmatite or fluid water with dissolved quartz in it to flow through those cracks. Now, quartz will not, this quartz sand is made of quartz. You can't get sand to dissolve in water at the temperatures and pressures that we have on the surface of the earth. But deep in the ground where the pressure is much greater and the heat is greater, this quartz can be dissolved in the water that's flowing through tiny cracks in the schist and the quartzite. And so what we can get actually fairly large veins of quartz, or we can get pretty narrow ones. Eventually, when the compression stops, the rock will cool off in very long periods of time, and the fluid with the quartz will solidify. The quartz will solidify in whatever crack was its mold, and you can get a piece of vein quartz that sometimes looks very much like a fossil because it will have the imprint of schist on the outside. And some people have told me they look like fossils of trees, but they're not. They're vein quartz that formed in a crack in schist. So it has an imprint of the schist, the layered rough schist on it that might look a little bit like tree bark to somebody. Mm-hmm. And the two pictures on the far right show one of a thicker piece of vein quartz that has the imprint of schist on the outside. And then the one on the very bottom, you can see the lineations that characterize schist rock. So that's vein quartz that formed in a schist mold. On the left-hand side, we also have a very large piece of vein quartz that the person's hand is pointing to. And those are really huge veins of quartz that formed in a large crack in schist. The schist around those veins was softer, so it eroded away and those veins kind of stick out. And but this is not schist, it's not quartzite, it's not, definitely not gneiss. And it's vein quartz, a lot of vein quartz in the Wissahickon. In the picture in the very middle, that's a very narrow, thin piece of vein quartz that's passing through quartzite. And very often you do find a stone that maybe has a little white band around it, and that's vein quartz that's somehow worked its way into a crack in that stone. The lower left picture is just a piece of vein quartz that was irregular in size, and it's called milky white quartz because it has no impurities in it. The quartz in its pure form is going to be white. If it has space, it'll form a very typical elongated crystal, but if it's compact, if there's not much space, it looks kind of like that picture on the lower left, which is milky white quartz. The picture on the upper left looks black because the quartz is weathered. But over on the right-hand side, you can see the vein quartz has kind of a coppery tinge. Those pieces of vein quartz had other things in them, probably some kind of material that rusted and gave it a coppery color. So you can get vein quartz that's gray or pure white or even copper colored, depending on what else was in the fluid that was passing through these cracks deep underground and it's eventually solidifying to form this vein quartz. So we've had 4 pieces of rock that you frequently find. We've had schist, which is layered, and we've had quartzite, and then we've had gneiss, and this is one more kind of rock that is quite common in the Wissahickon that you would come across. There are other kinds there, but 4 types of rock is plenty to learn
And
about.
don't forget pegmatite.
Oh, that's right. Okay, we've got 5. I did forget. And you know what? Pegmatite and granite. So there are many other kinds of rocks, but we've talked about 5 of them here
Yeah.
tonight. And that's enough. Your brains will get full if we go any further.
I almost feel like, because Lisa and I have gone out, vein quartz almost seems varsity level for people that are, I can walk out and like, well, that's schist, and beyond that, not quite so good. I'm better at identifying trees.
Yeah. But I think that if you don't understand vein quartz, you may find some rock that you think is a fossil of something, but it's not.
Okay.
Yeah.
And,
Well,
and I just want to say one thing about the pegmatite, because I had to try to figure out a way to, well, what's pegmatite and what's vein, the vein quartz, they kind of look white, they have little flecks in them. The pegmatite has much coarser and larger pieces in it, whereas the vein quartz would you say it's almost translucent, Sarah?
A little bit translucent, very uniform. If you look at the inside of it.
The texture is a big thing in identifying what you're looking at.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. And so I have kind of a basic question, but one that many people may have. Minerals, specifically, how are minerals formed, and like what's the difference between a rock and a mineral, because they're both formed underground? So what is what? I think Sarah, can you give us some info on minerals? And here's some pictures.
Pictures, yeah. Minerals are uniform substances. You can write a chemical formula for them. Like salt is a mineral, and its formula is NaCl for sodium and chloride. garnets are a mineral. They have a formula which is very long and complicated, but you can write a formula for garnet. And you can see a garnet in the upper left-hand corner. Tourmaline has a formula, and it's uniform that you can write one. In the middle picture that's labeled tourmaline shows some tourmaline crystals that are kind of rectangular. They're actually, if you looked at them in cross section, they would be triangles, but we're looking at them on a surface that looks rectangular. You can see them. They have a formula. Down at the bottom left is a crystal of mica that has its own formula. And there are two kinds of mica in the Wissahickon. Silvery mica that's called biotite mica, and actually black mica. Black mica is biotite and silvery mica is muscovite. I've got to go back and correct that. And you can see those. Now, if you put those minerals together with other substances, you get a rock. And a rock does not have a formula. It may be made of a large number of minerals, some of which are crystalline and some of which just look very uniform. So up in the upper right-hand corner, we have a piece of garnet schist that looks kind of like a chocolate chip cookie. And the chips in it are the garnets, and they are minerals. But in that rock, in that schist, there are clays and other kinds, and probably some mica. And you can't give a simple formula or any kind of formula for that rock. It's a mixture of different kinds of minerals. And so let's go on with how the minerals form. Is that the next thing that we get, Sean?
No.
Oh, no, that's later. That's later. Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, well, so I don't think we have a slide for that, but can you kind of tell us how minerals form? Because that is actually very interesting.
If there are minerals in a rock, you know that you have a metamorphic rock. In sedimentary rocks, all the whatever minerals are making up that rock are equally distributed through that rock. But when the rock undergoes metamorphism, it doesn't really melt down, but it stays a solid, but it develops the consistency of what you might see in what's called silly putty or therapy putty. It remains a solid, but it can flow. If you take a piece of silly putty or therapy putty and you make a little ball out of it and you put it in a dish, eventually that silly putty will flow into the shape of the dish, but it remains a solid. And in that kind of solid phase, the flowing solid phase, the molecules of different minerals can find each other. They can group together and form crystals. And these crystals will have a characteristic shape depending on the type of material. Mica forms a flat, layered crystal, quite flat. Sometimes you can have many, many layers, but the shape of the crystal is flat and transparent. A garnet will form a kind of dodecahedron shape. The dimensions are all equal in height and width and depth, but it has little flat surfaces on it. It's got a very characteristic shape. And tourmaline will form a long rod-like structure that's actually, if you look at it in cross section, is triangular. And so the minerals have characteristic shapes, but they need time to form during metamorphism, where the rock is in a solid but a flowing solid phase.
Thank you, Sarah.
Okay.
Yeah. So moving on to the next question, Wissahickon Valley Park is fairly big, as we know, 1,800 acres big. So can you guys tell us some specific areas to see some really, really cool rocks? And obviously we have an answer prepared because here's the next slide. So is this, Lisa, are you covering this one?
I can speak to this one.
Okay.
If you're familiar with the park, or by looking at the map, you can see that these exposures are located at the intersection of Forbidden Drive and Bells Mill Road. Additionally, if you park your car on Bells Mill in the upper lot on the Roxborough side, and you walk down that path from the parking lot towards the drive, you'll also see these exposures. This is talc schist. You may see this also mentioned as a serpentine exposure or serpentinite. The exact difference, I'm really not prepared to discuss, but I just want you to know that you may see this exposure described as a serpentine exposure. For purposes of our discussion, we're going to call it talc schist. Whatever you call it, there's a few things to know about it. Namely is that it's very unique and not found anywhere else in the park but here. So there are other materials in this rock. It's a metamorphic rock formed very deep within the surface. And this exposure, well, it's black because of weathering, but if you were to see an unweathered piece, like that picture on the right, you can find exposed pieces about 250 feet up from that intersection. There is a series of round boulders that are this same kind of rock. And you'll see this little broken off piece. You'll really actually get to look and see what it looks like inside. So this exposure contains a mineral that's very rich in iron and magnesium, and it's called magnetite. Those are the little black squares. That greenish color is due to the presence of chlorite, which is another very soft mineral. But the thing that makes this most unique is how this talc schist is very, very soft, and you can scratch it with your nail. This rock is also known as soapstone. And talc is the softest mineral that we know of. And this rock is very easily scratched, and it's formed very deep within the surface, and under the surface, the talc is more stable. But once it comes to the surface, it is not as stable. So this was not a very good building material. So this definitely wasn't used for building, but it is unique. And this location is really the only place that you can see it. And there's further discussion about this site in one of our self-guided hikes. You can see this up close and personal, right on Forbidden.
It's unique and it's easily accessible.
Yes.
Easily accessible.
So that is worth mentioning. And I believe the next one is actually just north of that, off of Forbidden Drive, also easily accessible.
Yep. So this one is the 19th century granite quarry, and it's a little further up from where Lisa was talking about. If you walk up Forbidden Drive towards Northwestern Avenue, you'll see it on the left. It's a cutout of a hill, which it was a quarry. And this is an example of a sill. And as Sarah touched on before, a sill is a geological formation that was created when the magma is coming up through the crust. And well, if the magma breaks through, then you have a volcano. But this magma, instead, it decided to kind of slide more parallel to the ground and through the layers of, well, this is the schist. It flowed through the layers, and it eventually cooled and solidified. And that would be a sill. And the quarry itself is approximately 76 feet wide. It is of granite, so that was the sill that came up. And then it is surrounded on both the left and right sides and on the top by schist. And the granite itself is a lighter color than the schist, and the schist is darker, obviously. If you look at the picture, I mean, it's hard for me to see when I go there. The color is hard to see because it is it's in shadow a lot, especially in the summer, whenever the trees are, the leafed out. But the way I can tell is that if you look at the granite in the picture, it breaks off into cracks along the joint. So it looks more blocky, like you can see, looks like large blocks there. And then the schist itself is that foliated, that layered look. And if you look at the top of the picture, sort of near the tree line, you can kind of see where it's more layered. See it there. And as you can see, you can definitely see the schist as you're walking towards it, like along Forbidden Drive, you'll see the schist. And then when you get to the quarry, you're like, oh gosh, that's not schist, that's granite. So that's what I think is neat about this. It's like a huge geologic formation, and you can see it up close and personal. Because of humans, people came in and they found a little bit, and because of their knowledge, they were able to cut into the earth and expose it, and we were able to learn more about it.
Yeah, awesome. Also easily accessible. I think the next two are not quite as easily accessible. So these are off the Orange Trail. I think, Sarah, you're going to be talking about.
Yeah. Can you just go back one more
Oh,
back
sure.
to the granite again?
Yeah.
The rock that you see in the inside at the bottom is a piece of that granite from that quarry, and you can see it has the same composition as the pegmatite that we talked about earlier, but the texture is much finer, and so it formed pretty much the same way, but a little less water content. It cooled off faster, so the little crystals of feldspar didn't have as much of a chance to grow. And I think it's a really interesting place to look at the geology of the Wissahickon. But let's look at the next one. We've put together 2 self-guided field trips. The first 2 sites that we've talked about are from a field trip that goes between Bells Mills Road and Northwestern Avenue. And it's pretty accessible for all ages who are mobile enough, and for kids. And that, I think, has it been posted yet, Sean?
Not yet, no.
But
So yeah,
it'll
once
be
I
soon.
think we're gonna have the finalized version. So that will
Yeah.
be on the FOW website on the Virtual Valley shortly. But we do currently have your Gems of the Wissahickon article that people can
Which
read.
has a lot of what we've talked about today. The other field trip that we've been working on, and Lisa has been working very hard to field test it, and a lot of these pictures are hers, is more rugged. It's less accessible. It goes on the east side of the creek, starting close to the Valley Green Bridge, and then going up to the McGargy Dam on the white and the orange trails. And we've just picked out 2 sites from each one of these to tell you a little bit about, maybe to whet your appetite and make you want to go out and see for yourself. But this is I call it the rock with a missing wedge. And Lisa's put some arrows on this picture for us. Way up at the top on the right, you can see a black arrow, and that's where the missing wedge is. As this rock formed, it was being compressed from what is now its top to its bottom. And remember, it's way underground, it's deep underground, so that the rock is a little bit pliable. Most of the rock is schist. It has a lot of vein quartz in it, but it's layered. It's a layered, finely layered rock, but it's cracked in different places. And the cracks are the one very nice X-shaped crack is shown with a red arrow. And these geologists love to think of fancy names for things. This is called a conjugate joint set, but it just shows you that the rock was being compressed from the top to the bottom and cracked. and the size of the angles that X makes are not the same. The top and the angles facing the top of and the bottom of the rock are a little narrower. So it also shows us this rock was being compressed from the top to the bottom. But the big feature in this rock that I find really fun to look at is shown with the 3 yellow arrows, and it's called a semi-recumbent fold of quartzite. A lot of the quartzite and schist we see in the Wissahickon is layered. The quartzite generally being more on the bottom, and the schist, which is over it. And remember, schist is descended from mud, and quartzite is descended from sand. So they've got different parent rocks. But this is a rock where probably when it initially formed, the quartzite, which is now folded up, it was a bottom layer, and the schist formed on top of it. And then plate tectonics continued, and very slowly this rock was uplifted, like it was in a huge collision. Think of 2 massive trucks running into each other. The front ends are going to be all crumpled. And this is kind of what happened to this rock. The schist folded on the bottom, and the quartzite folded on the bottom, and the schist folded on top of it. And then the collision continued, and the whole thing folded over and lay on its side. So the top, the highest up yellow arrow represents the top of a fold. And then the arrow that's just a little further down, but closer to the top, is the top part of that fold. And the bottom arrow is the bottom part of the fold. So you can see the quartzite comes up, turns around, and goes back down again. And remember, this is happening deep underground. These collisions are not sudden and massive and over. They continue for millions of years. And so very long. Plate tectonics, the movement of plates is about the same rate as your fingernails grow. So it's not something that's happening fast. It's deep underground, and it's a very slow process. And then the erosion that Jenny told us about cleared away the 10 miles of overlying rock that to expose this stuff that was deep underground when it formed. And that, of course, again took maybe 250,000 years to happen.
So
Okay,
a very, very slow car crash.
Yeah. Yeah. Doesn't it kind of look like a wrecked
It
car?
does. No, yeah, and once you said that, now I can't unsee it.
Yeah.
So, thank you for that analogy, Sarah.
Okay.
And finally, you're going to talk about not to call it we saved the best for last, but
Yeah.
this is one of the best. And also, I should also mention that this has been nicknamed Sarah's Rock after Sarah West.
Okay, and I'm so honored to have that happen. But I did take groups on geology walks for quite a long time, and this was absolutely my favorite rock. It's shown on the map that Sean put in. It's on it's pretty high up on a hill. Lisa, is it the orange trail or the white trail that this is on?
This would be the white trail.
Okay, so when you're looking for it, you follow the orange trail for a while, and then the white trail goes uphill, branches off from the orange trail, and eventually you come to this rock that's described in our field trip that isn't quite ready to get put up, but will be within the next couple of weeks. And you can see it was at one time a rock that may have been predominantly schist, but it's got stripes going through it that when you get real close to them, you can recognize as pegmatite. And there's a big pegmatite band lying down at the bottom part of that picture in the middle. And then there are smaller, but really quite thick. They're the width of your hand in the middle, in that schist. And probably what happened was that this rock is involved deep underground in this very prolonged collision. So the schist part got deformed. It got separated into layers, and the pegmatite oozed its way in between those layers. And then the collision continued, and the whole thing got folded up some more. So the rock got is folded all together, but the pegmatite had to have worked its way into the layers before the continuing collision made that rock fold. And near the pegmatite bands, if you find that rock and can look at it closely, you'll find rock that'll be like what Jenny described, nice, very finely banded, dark and light rock. And that rock continued an even higher metamorphism because the pegmatite was hot as it flowed. And we have rock, the whole thing was very metamorphic, but the stuff that's nearest the pegmatite flows got higher temperature, higher pressure treatment. So it's got a higher degree of metamorphism, and we call it nice, and it's very nice.
It is very nice.
And that rock is just stunningly beautiful.
It really is. And if the people watching have not seen it, please make sure you take a trip.
Yeah.
It's a short hike from Valley Green Inn, and it's worth stopping to gawk at because it really is fantastic.
But it's not an easy trail. It's a rugged trail, so you have to be confident that you're going to be safe on that trail. That exposure is really quite large, and it extends underground, and it reappears very close to the creek. And if you take that field trip, you'll be guided in visiting that exposure and its extension and some other really interesting places.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Sarah. And so a final question for all three of you is, what advice do you have for anybody that's just starting to get into rocks, for all of us novices out there? And hold on, I'm going to unshare. And who would like to go first?
I'll go. So I guess, my own experience was just looking at pictures and books and taking guided walks and asking questions, getting out there and actually looking at the rock. Field identification is my thing. So I like to, try to identify what I'm seeing, but, ask questions, look in books, take pictures with you. And it's a journey. So you'll always be learning about it.
Thanks. How about you, Jenny? What advice do you have for folks that are just trying to get interested?
I think once those guided hikes are up, definitely take advantage of those. I mean, I learned so much going out with Sarah and Lisa, just looking at it and kind of matching up what we're reading to what we're looking at, which is really cool. Also, like when you go out, bring a magnifying glass, bring a nail, get up close and personal with those rocks, look for colors, patterns, try to figure out, what you're looking at. And then also just take a step back and look at the bigger picture. What's that rock part of? Is it in the, is it in the middle of the creek? Is it on the side of the mountain, or whatever it is? Just kind of get a sense of how big it is and what you're looking at, and think how it got there and what weathering conditions had to happen for it to be exposed. So, I mean, I could go on and but basically just get out there and look and enjoy.
Follow the mystery.
Exactly.
Thank you, Jenny. And finally, Sarah, what advice do you have for folks that are interested?
I just pick up on one of Jenny's ideas. I think what I think starts you off well is to really enjoy these rocks, and they're awesome. They're forged in the process of plate tectonics deep in the ground, way below what we can see. We're looking at the roots of an ancient mountainous mass of land. But I think the best thing to do is to just learn to observe for yourself, trust your own observations, enjoy them. They tell us a story, and you can learn about that, but don't try to learn everything at one time. It could be overwhelming if you went out to look at rocks and expected to be an expert on your first trip. But I just advise people to learn a little bit at a time and let your knowledge unfold gradually, and just enjoy that journey of encountering the rocks and learning to understand them and learning to read the story they tell, because they're a history book in their own right, and it's not going to be fully apparent to you on your first trip. So look for yourself, and remember, we've given you some theory, but nobody was here when this happened, so we don't have any firsthand observations.
That we know of, Sarah.
Well, I'm not old enough to have seen it. Yeah. Geologists will tell you different things. You'll get different stories when you read different sources. And I've always said, if you're going to go on a field trip with a geologist, you just go with one of them. Because if you go with one geologist, or maybe one of us, you're going to come back knowing exactly what you've seen. But if you go with two people, two geologists, you're going to come back totally confused. But most of all, enjoy those Wissahickon rocks, and help us take care of them.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you, Jenny and Lisa as well. And I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. I hope you've learned something about rocks, and I hope that it's whet your appetite to go out and explore and learn more about our fantastic park and the really fascinating elements that created all the rocks. So we made lots of mention to the self-guided hikes that will be posted to our website very shortly. If you haven't checked us out, make sure you go to fow.org, and on the main page, if you click on Virtual Valley, there are tons and tons of educational resources. And on the Creekside Classroom page of the Virtual Valley, you'll find an article that Sarah West wrote called Gems of the Wissahickon that covers a lot of what we talked about and some of it in a little bit more depth. But that will also be the location to look for the self-guided hikes, which will have lots of info and photos so you can download it and head out on the trail and go see some of the spots we talked about. So, but if anybody has any questions, unfortunately, we're not taking questions tonight, but feel free to send me an email. That would be green like the color at fow.org, and I will pass it on to our rock stars, Sarah, Lisa, and Jenny, and we'll see if they can come up with some questions. Feel free to try to stump them if you want to, and we'll probably compile them. I see Jenny. Well, I see that as a challenge, so I'm going to try to stump you, Sarah. But anybody, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight, and I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of the week, and that you all stay safe and happy and healthy. So, and hopefully we'll see you in the Wissahickon sometime, if it's soon, hopefully with a mask and at a social distance, safe social distance. All right, so take care, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks for coming.
Bye.